If you're just going to resort to blanket bans, you're ignoring the voices of the young people who are using them, and you're not actually thinking about their experiences online. A lot of adults don't want to be in the same spaces as kids. They don't want to be in a chat room with 15-year-olds. And in some cases, will pay for the privilege of not having to be in the same spaces as young people.
Today we are joined by Vaishnavi. Vaishnavi is one of the world's leading experts on child safety and age-appropriate design. She spent 15 years developing youth safety products and solutions for the biggest tech companies with products used by billions of people. Vaishnavi was the global head of youth policy at Meta, where she worked on Instagram, Facebook, AI, VR, and Messenger. Before Meta, she led Twitter's live streaming and video safety efforts and was Twitter's first head of safety in the Asia-Pacific region. Previously, Vaishnavi was Google's child safety and privacy lead for the Asia-Pacific region. Now, she is the founder of Vianum Strategy, which is a firm that works to promote online child safety. We've crossed paths on a couple of different task forces dedicated to online child safety, and I'm confident in saying I've never met someone who understands the product side of youth online safety better than Vaishnavi. So I'm really excited that she's able to join us today and help us all learn more about creating a better online space for young people. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. That is such a nice introduction. Thanks, Matt. It's really good to be here.
Of course. I'm honored to have you. So where would you like to start?
Oh, I don't know. There's not much going on in child safety, right? It's a pretty quiet space, is what I've heard.
Yeah, no controversies this year, no congressional testimonies, none of that.
Oh, no, nothing. Well, I don't know. I think I'm just curious what you think, as someone who's observing all this, what you think have been some of the biggest flashpoints of child safety this year. I'm always curious to know what others feel is kind of the big thing going on. What are the big flashpoints you felt happened this year? I imagine, certain books are a part of it, but what did you see as some of these big moments around child safety?
Yeah, okay, so as you and many other people know, my focus has always been on politics and trying to combat things like misinformation and foreign election interference and these kinds of things. And therefore, I don't have nearly the experience that you do, but I think it was last year that I was brought into child safety upon reading Jeff Horowitz's expose of the massive networks of child sexual exploitation on Instagram and later on some of the other platforms too. So that kind of drew me in and oh my goodness, this is really bad. And then I did a lot of work with the Integrity Institute and some of the other groups that were advising the Senate Judiciary Committee leading into the testimony and the hearing in January. So I've spent a lot more time thinking about it because of that. And I think, to me, the scariest flashpoints and the most important things that we need to deal with when it comes to child safety online, it's got to be child sexual abuse material, sexual exploitation, financial extortion, when these malicious actors would pretend to be a young person or maybe someone that's a little older but wants to message a kid, and then they do, and then they'll friend them or follow them or whatever and get their friends list and then say, hey, I'm gonna send inappropriate pictures of you to all of your friends, your family, your coworkers, your teachers, whoever. And that to me is the really devastating harm. And that's the harm that those are the issues that I think we don't spend nearly enough time talking about in the kind of the mainstream discourse. We in kind of the trust and safety space, we of course do, but so much of the oxygen in mass media it has been dedicated to, does asking someone how many minutes they spent on a platform last week map onto changes in their anxiety over a decade? The data are not compelling on that point, but the data on whether you've been extorted or exploited or abused, those data are super clear. When those later issues happen, that has hugely negative effects on people's lives. And it's not just in the short run, it's not I feel sad today or I feel anxious now. It could persist because those are really traumatic experiences. So As the resident expert here, I would love to know what you think.
I agree. I think there was a lot of conversations around mental health and anxiety and depression in the first half of the year. And over the last, I'd say 6 months, there's just been a lot more conversations about much higher severity harms, not to discount at all the importance of the initial conversations, but, conversations around sextortion, financial scams being perpetrated against young people, children dying of suicide after having conversations with AI-generated personas. These are really high severity harms that we're talking about, and I think that conversation has shifted over the course of the year. I do think they're all now, very much in the public discourse. I spoke to a parent a couple of days ago who was telling me about how, she never used to be too worried about her son because he plays a lot of games, but she's very worried about her daughter who's on social media. And now is actually, and that's changed. She's like, oh, now I'm actually really worried about my son who plays games. So, there's this broader understanding of harms, not just the different types of harm, but like where they can take place. It's not just your traditional social media outlets. And the other thing that's been really interesting for me to see this year is this slow but extremely strong pull towards platform design obligations. At the start of the year when I was writing for Tech Policy Press or kind of publishing our monthly newsletter, I always made our position very clear, which is that I don't think there's too much more room for parental controls in products. There are far too many products to navigate. There's an immense amount of surveillance that's required for that level of parental supervision, and it's just not practical. We have all these products, we know how low the uptake is on them. And so we used to make the argument at the start of the year that platform design is actually where we need to make the largest number of changes. And got a lot of criticism for that. And I think now, at the end of the year, there's almost no debate that a lot of the decisions and changes that have to happen need to occur on the platform side. That's not to say there's no role for parental controls or for education or digital literacy. Of course there is. But it's not a substitute for meaningful product and policy and operations changes. So it's been very gratifying but also sad to see that change over the course of this year, and it just happened. It's not even been a year, right? It's been like maybe 10 months. How quickly public opinion has shifted.
Yeah, so I think that it's interesting to see how things have changed, and I don't know that it's for the better, at least in the public, maybe not yet. Because I feel like a lot of the initiatives that are being advocated for by policymakers and kind of media pundits, they tend to be things that sound really good. Like, oh, we need to verify ages, or we need to ban kids from using social media, or ban them from having smartphones. And one thing I dislike about all of those options is that it doesn't create any accountability for the companies making these products. And in so doing, it doesn't actually fix any problems. It just shoves them under the rug, because the bad stuff will still exist online, because none of these pieces of legislation or proposals do anything about that. It's just like, oh, oh, tobacco is bad for people, or alcohol is bad for people. Oh, I know. Let's set an age limit. You can't use it. You can't have it. And nobody ever in the history of humanity has done something that they're not allowed to do. Which is why our prisons are empty. Which is why we don't have a backlog in our court system. And, like, bans don't work. People get around them. And what happens when we ban things is that we make it taboo, and people do it in secret. And when people are doing things in secret, they're even less likely to get help or feel like they can ask for help from their parents if somebody is doing, like, threatening them with extortion or any of the other horrible things that they could be. So these proposals, they drive me bonkers because it's not fixing the problem. It's just saying, oh yeah, let's do the same thing we've done many times before, that's failed many times before, and expect a different outcome. Where I come from, that's the definition of insanity. And as wacky as I am, I try my best to at least make decisions based on data. So what do you think of the current proposals, and what's most likely to lead to a safer place online for young people especially?
Yeah, I talk about this in a couple of different issues of Quire about how we've seen this big pendulum swing over the last 25 years from an extremely libertarian approach to tech, saying that there's really no responsibility on platforms to govern or design or account for the experiences of their users. And we've seen that pendulum now swing very dramatically to the other end of what Dana Boyd calls tech solutionism, that tech is the root of all evil and that it needs to be banned or clamped down on. And the problem with both of these camps is that they allow for absolutely no platform accountability. Like you said, there's no role for platforms to play. We can't have a conversation around let's design better. And by the way, we can design better. We're the ones who designed it. So why couldn't we create? And it's not like this technology has been around since the beginning of time. It emerged in literally our lifetimes. And so I think that's really challenging, because now you're seeing this pendulum swing to the side of bans and warning labels and very, I think, draconian measures don't actually have the best interest of the child at heart. If you were to compare these measures against established human rights principles around what is in the best interest of the child, what is a child's right to safety, but also a right to privacy, to access of information, these principles would not hold up against, these policies these policies would not hold up against these principles. And I find that really challenging, because this has historically been the case. I'm going to nerd out a little and talk about how children have never been a voting bloc. So we've always used child safety as a cudgel to actually get, I'm going to say that again. We've always used child safety as a cudgel to get other types of really draconian measures through. And I really think that's what's happening here. For example, when we talk about social media bans, sure, that sounds great. Who's going to be doing the banning? We've already seen platforms step up and say, sure, we'll ban kids from the platform. It's the app store's responsibility to tell us how old they are. The app stores are like, please do not talk to me. I have no interest in this conversation. Meanwhile, then you have conversations around device manufacturers. They'll be the ones to verify age. And this debate will become the meat of this supposedly good policy to ban children from social media. So I have really strong feelings about banning children from accessing products and experiences that are really great for them in many ways, but that also can be more responsibly designed. And then my final piece of this little rant is that we don't have a good definition of what social media is. Do games fall under social media? Do conversations in closed group chats count as social media? At what point is it social? We don't have a clear definition for that. And by ignoring a clear definition and using this policy as a way to target the biggest traditional social media networks, you're actually completely ignoring how children and teens actually spend their time online. End rant.
So how did children actually spend their time online?
That's a great question, Matt. They're spending their time online in a variety of different social ways. So they're interacting with one another in games. They are trading with one another in live auctions. They are purchasing products online. They're discovering and purchasing products online. And then, yes, they are on social media platforms as well. They're also on platforms that favor editing and community editing of creative projects together. So they're online and they're social, but that doesn't mean that they're only on a social media platform as we traditionally define it. And we're not really talking about any of those other ways in which they engage.
Yeah, Professor Andy Shabilsky at Oxford Internet Institute, he came on and he told me something that I didn't know about, which is not all that uncommon, but one thing that jumped out at me was that apparently kids bully each other in Google Docs.
Oh yeah, I mean, is the comments section of Google Docs now going to be considered social media? Our emoji, our collaborative editing software going to be considered social media? But this is what I mean, right? There's no thoughtfulness behind this, and it's not. I think the lack of thoughtfulness suggests a lack of actual concern for children and a lack of actual concern for how to make their experiences online better. I'm all for practical design, policy, product, engineering recommendations. I think it is absolutely in the realm of civil society and government to have strong opinions on that. But if you're just going to resort to sort of blanket bans, you're ignoring the voices of the young people who are using them, and you're not actually thinking about their experiences online.
Okay, so what are the most promising levers that you see to actually address some of these underlying issues?
I think there's a number of different things that we can talk about. You briefly touched on age assurance and age verification. I think that the reason it comes up so much is people think of it as a way to ban young people from certain experiences online, but it feeds into the concept of age-appropriate design, which is we can tailor, for example, the default settings or the types of content that people are seeing or the kinds of experiences that they are able to have online if we know how old they are. And while there are many challenges with age verification, there are also many challenges with unverified states of age. And so I think we should be thinking about, and we work with a lot of clients on thinking about their age-appropriate design strategy. And frequently the conversation will start with, we would like to assure age. And the next question that I always have to ask is like, cool, what do you want to do with it? Like, what is the age going to be used for? And interestingly, folks don't always have a clear idea of what they want to use that age for, right? They'll say things like, oh, I just want to, make sure that's a requirement. That's age assurance law, so I want to make sure I verify age. That's the letter of the law. It's not the spirit of the law. And so thinking about, well, how do you want to customize that experience is really important. I think topic controls and algorithmic choice is set to be a really big topic of discussion over the next year or the next few years. And I think it's a really valuable conversation to have. Can you give more people more control over what they're actually seeing on their feeds? And then I think we can really think a good amount about transparency. How do we think about transparency when it comes to youth audiences and to their parents? What do we want to share with them, with both parties, about how they're using online experiences? So many different things I think we could talk about from a very specific product point of view.
Yeah, so as someone that's done some research on user controls and transparency issues and giving people more control over what they see in their feeds, I've always been quite disappointed by the absurdly low uptake of these tools. And I think Evan Spiegel, the CEO of Snapchat, earlier this year came out and said that they launched parental controls for teen accounts, and I think 1% of the teens' accounts had those enacted, and then only 2% of parents were doing anything with it. So I was like, okay, so there's this lot of public support for these parental controls, but when they're given the control, nobody uses them. Pretty much nobody uses them. And I think a lot of these platforms would also say that we do give people the control to tailor the algorithm and their feeds to show them what they want by like providing lightweight negative feedback or reporting content and saying, show me less of this, show me more of this, depending on which platform it is. So I think the platforms would probably say, we are giving people the control over that. But again, most people don't understand how ranking works, so they don't realize like, oh, if I report this content, or if I hide it, or if I click on the little gray X in the corner of the card on the feed, that is a signal to the algorithm that, oh, I shouldn't stop showing this person this kind of stuff. So I'm curious what kind of user controls do you think that people would uptake, or what kind of like media literacy or training do you think is necessary to get people to do something that requires a little bit of effort but would probably amount to a better experience for them?
So I'll push back a little bit here and say that I don't think that topic controls are anywhere near as good as they should be right now. And, in the words of many trust and safety people, all of this boils down to a content moderation problem. Defining clear categories of content is very difficult to do. There are now, automated platforms and AI-powered platforms that are offering solutions around this, but it's really hard to qualify what exactly, for example, is a post that might be related to body image, or what exactly is a post that might be related to depression or anxiety. So our current levels of granularity around topic controls are not nearly sufficient. Now that's extremely labor intensive, but this is also an incredibly nuanced space. It's also really hard when you think about the fact that content labeling or topic controls, which are a really big part of algorithmic ranking, need to operate at a very enormous scale. So if you think about a YouTube or a TikTok, you're getting millions of uploads every day, and it's a Herculean task. What is actually like a joke or a meme in one culture and harmless versus actually a very harmful stereotype in another culture, and how do you offer that control to someone? Something that I thought about a lot in the body image and eating disorder space when I was at Instagram, and this is really just my personal opinion, not at all the company's opinion, is I heard so much from people, friends, family, and people who were struggling with body image issues, that they were like, I don't want to see diet content in my feed. I don't want to see any recommendations around diet. And technically speaking, that is a topic control that you can choose. But what gets classified as a diet is extremely restricted. There's a very small amount of content that definitively is called diet content. What you would see instead, for example, what you would still see instead is content around clean eating or content around intermittent fasting, all of which is a type of diet. But for someone who's struggling with thoughts of body image dysmorphia or struggling with disordered eating, that's extremely triggering. So I think there's a lot of work that we can do to introduce more granularity to topic controls. I think we have much more powerful AI-powered tools now at our disposal than we did even 3 years ago. So I think it's a good market for that. And then I think the other piece there is, you're right, a lot of users don't want to be fiddling with various knobs and levers around their algorithmic experience. But what's valuable about providing algorithmic choice is that you can then introduce default settings for young people. You can say, okay, for young people, we are going to eliminate a certain range of topics from discussion or include them only in an educational context, or we are going to design the algorithms so that inflammatory or rage-baiting content just doesn't get to the top of their feeds ever. Those are very practical steps that you can take around how young people experience their algorithmic feeds. But again, these are all talking about very traditional social media platforms. It doesn't really apply to, like, say, live chat in a game or to live chat in an auction or a marketplace. So I do think we need to be very clear about exactly what experience is the young person going through, what are the potential vectors for harm, what are the universe of mitigations possible to address those harms, and then what are the trade-offs of those mitigations. And this is the exact life cycle that we take clients through when they're thinking about their child safety needs. Like, okay, what exactly does your product do? Let's not just assume that, oh, you run a social media platform, therefore these are all the harms that your youth users might experience.
I think so. You raise a great, and this is something that I've dealt with, kind of like jumping between a couple of different teams at one of my old companies, where one team controlled the feed, and another team controlled the classifier. There was an order that we needed to demote a particular topic of content, and the feed team was like, "Oh, we're just gonna take all the stuff that's classified by that and multiply it by some very small number." And then the team that controlled the classifier did not like this idea, so they started removing things from the classifier. So some obvious elements were being removed. So if we're thinking about like political content, it's like, oh, well, I don't want to demote political content, so maybe I'll just say, oh, racial justice, that's not political. That's something else. Or climate, that's not political. That's sustainability or some other kind of issue. So the point that I think is tricky here and it is relevant to what you're saying is that stakeholders have different definitions of what the content is, and I'm talking about just within a single company, but policy definitions differ from company to company. And as these companies release their transparency reports and we try to make sense of, oh, well, this platform says they have a prevalence of 1% of, I don't know, child bullying or something, and this one says they have a 0.1%. Is this platform over here better? Or do they just have worse measurement of the issue? And both of those could be possible, but it's really hard when you don't have standardized definitions of what some of these harms are. And one possibility could be like, okay, so if there's some sort of regulation, federal regulation, state regulation, that says, all right, this is what cyberbullying is, or this is what extortion is, or whatever the harms are that you're trying to combat against are, or what the like dieting, if we want to stick with that example, then dieting would include intermittent fasting and carnivore, or like veganism, whatever, or unhealthy body image pictures and things like that. So if there was some kind of outside body that said, okay, these are the definitions, now you have to build classifiers to predict that, as opposed to letting companies define, this is what body image, or this is what diet is to us. You can choose or not to have the same definition at these other companies. But I think without some kind of external definition or governing body, it's hard to really get these companies that are often for profit in competition with each other to agree on these things, because why would they?
I think we do have some promising examples of what this can look like in practice. So if you look at the Digital Services Act and their risk assessments, they allow companies to define an issue area as they would define it, to then share data on how they're mitigating those risks as they define mitigations. And then you have all this data now that independent researchers and folks like yourself can actually dig into and draw comparative analyses around. So I don't think we necessarily need to have an external definition, but we do need more transparency around what those definitions are. Even a single platform could have multiple slightly different definitions of the same harm depending on the type of surface that you're talking about. And does this particular harm have the same definition if someone is searching for it versus if they're talking to someone about it versus if they're creating videos and images about it? Like, there are different definitions and nuances there. One thing that I really empathize with researchers in the space on is just the lack of data that's available, and the need to then essentially rejigger those systems from the outside, and then only to have a platform tell you, no, actually that's wrong, that's actually not how it works. And I'm like, well, you tell me how it works then, you give me the data on how it works. So even if we can have more transparency in what different policies are, how they vary, and it's fine, different platforms can have different definitions, that's their right, but then we can do the work. We can actually, or I say we, I'm not an academic, you guys can do the work of assessing and figuring out where, how different companies are doing.
Yeah, and so on the one hand, the Digital Services Act is very exciting because it does call for greater transparency. And now, since the act has been fully implemented, these platforms are pretty much lining up, with the exception of maybe Twitter or X. Most of the platforms are like, oh yeah, all right, we're expanding access to data. But in my role, particularly with the Integrity Institute, I work with a lot of organizations in the US, but especially in Europe. And when I talk to representatives from those agencies, they're like, oh, yeah, we used to have access to these tools that, say, Meta made publicly available or Google made publicly available, and now we don't. And there was there was a representative from Meta who showed up at one of these workshops I was in, and he was given a talk about the Meta Content Library, which was replacing our beloved CrowdTangle. Rest in peace. But everybody in the room said that they had like they raised their hand and said, oh yeah, I could access CrowdTangle. And then the presenter was like, well, who here has access to the Meta Content Library? And everybody dropped their hands except for one person. I look and see who the guy is. It's the guy from Meta that runs the Meta Content Library. I'm like, oh, this is not good. This is... Okay, so there's a law that says you have to be more transparent. Yet, in reality, they're being less transparent, or it's like the data access is heavily restricted. And, I mean, Twitter really, I think, kicked off like a second element of this restricted data access by shifting their free API to being one that I did the math at one point. It was like $500,000 for an entire year of access to data that's roughly equivalent to what you could get for free before. And an independent researcher or an academic or a nonprofit organization, like the groups of people that actually would use the data to try to understand what's going on in those platforms and ways to improve it and identify harms before they get out of hand, they just can't afford that. That's an insane amount. Maybe not for the world's richest person. It's not a lot of money, but for you or I or anybody that wants to make the online space safer, like that's unreasonable. And then like Reddit and some of the other companies, they kind of followed suit with charging a lot for APIs. So even though the policy landscape is such that data transparency is increasingly required, the practice of it is not being followed. So
yeah, we don't have any strong enforcement measures yet, right? There's no clear idea on what it looks like to not be compliant with transparency measures or access to information. And in a way, so one of the challenging / weird things about the work that I do now is that we're very squarely in the middle, where we don't do any policy advocacy. We're not a lobbying shop. Our job is literally to say, this is what users, governments, civil society, academics, this is what they expect of you, company. What would you like to do about it? And then we kind of figure out how to implement that in practice. But what that means is that a lot of times I do have a lot of empathy for companies, because they're in this... There's a feeling, I think, especially among some of the larger platforms, that they, I want to say in quotation marks, did so much for so long and never got their flowers, never got the recognition for putting in all the effort that they were putting in. And I understand that from a very human level. Like if I worked on something very hard for a long time and didn't get a lot of love for it, I can see why I would be reluctant to do it in the future. Unfortunately, these are not individuals, these are systems, these are companies, and you don't get flowers for doing trust and safety right. You just don't. And we know that, being in trust and safety, we just don't get flowers. It's our obligation to do this. If it's actually the trade-off for getting to create these very exciting, cool, interesting products. So I do have empathy, but at the same time, and this is a little bit of a tangent, I also think that people have started to regard transparency, safety, privacy measures as impediments to doing business rather than a source of growth and innovation. And that's really unfortunate, because I do think that designed right, good products are like a really great a really great representation of good engineering and good product development. So I think about cases where from 2016 to 2022, we saw all these product changes around youth safety that were great product changes. We made default settings stricter. Privacy controls became much more restrictive. We stopped profiling teens we stopped allowing advertisers to profile teens based on a wide range of demographic content. These were great measures, and they made the companies more interesting and innovative as a result. And so when companies have this approach of seeing it as, I'm just going to do the bare legal minimum that I have to do because this is an impediment to growth, we sometimes have to look through the roadmap and be like, this is actually a great opportunity for growth for you. So and a good example of this, despite I think the many legitimate kind of debates around age verification, one way in which age verification is really valuable is that a lot of adults don't want to be in the same spaces as kids. They don't want to be in a chat room with 15-year-olds. And in some cases, will pay for the privilege of not having to be in the same spaces as young people. So you're putting age assurance systems in front of them to verify that they're an adult. In some cases, they pay to verify that they are an adult so that they don't have to be in spaces with children. Now, that's a great user experience you're providing, right? There's, I think, complexity to all of this and nuance to all of this that, if properly harnessed, can be a real source of growth for a company.
What are some of these spaces that people pay to not be around children? And don't just say
Portugal. So I think if you, the closest example I can think of is if you look at Avakin Life. Have you played Avakin Life?
No.
It's a great game. But yeah, people pay, like adults pay to verify their age and then get access to these 18 plus spaces where they are in 18 plus chat rooms, or they get skins that are 18 plus, they get experiences that are 18 plus, and they're very happy to do it. That's, I think, a really good example of where you're offering your consumers something that they want. Most people are not trying to be in inappropriate conversations or having a ton of engagement with people substantially outside of their age group.
In those cases, it also seems like the adults that want to be age verified are not the ones that we need to be worried about in these youth spaces. So, like, okay, great. They're paying so that they can just talk to other adults. It's the adults that don't want to be verified that pretend to be a child or follow only a bunch of, I don't know, 8-year-old girls on Instagram, even though you're supposed to be 13 to be on there. Those are the ones that freak me out and that I'm most concerned about. But that type of age verification model doesn't actually do anything to address them.
Well, I think there's two different use cases we're talking about here. If you're a platform that wants to offer 18 plus experiences, and 18 plus doesn't have to necessarily be salacious, it could just be experiences that are meant for adults and not for children. So in that particular use case, that's a value that you can add. Where you're talking about age assurance to keep adults out of motivated, predatory adults out of children's spaces, I think age verification is certainly an option, but I agree that there are many kind of trade-offs that need to be considered there. One of the things that's interesting to me about age assurance kind of moving forward is that the increases in cryptographic technology have been so interesting over the last few years that I do think we're heading to a significantly more private version of age assurance than we had even, I think, 3 years ago. So that's quite heartwarming to me to see, because at the end of the day, we want to be providing solutions that are privacy preserving, that are minimizing data. And so if you look at practices where once you've verified the age, you delete all the information, you only send an age signal back to the platform that needs it, there's a significant amount of privacy baked into that. Now, I don't want to sound like a flag bearer for age assurance, because again, that's not our job, but it is all I'm saying is that these things are messy and nuanced, and there's a lot of actual like business value and safety value to be gained in navigating that nuance.
So one of the pieces of age assurance that makes me think that people advocating for it are maybe not thinking all the way through it is that, yes, most US adults, they support age verification or age assurance at this point based on the latest Pew data that I've seen. So, okay, that makes sense. But my suspicion as a social scientist is that these adults are thinking, oh yeah, of course I want my kids to verify their ages, but I don't want to have to like upload my driver's license or social security card or passport or whatever to Facebook or Twitter or wherever, because I already am uncomfortable with these platforms having as much data on me as they do, and they don't have a great record in terms of keeping your data private and secure, and now like with all of the training of AI models, that's I can imagine that there are lots of use cases that they might use that data to train things that we might not be comfortable with. And my suspicion is that adults aren't really thinking that they also will have to verify their ages to use these tools if these laws pass.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that a lot of adults really consider that. And I also don't think that companies necessarily understand that they don't have to verify age if their products are, or rather, they don't have to verify the age of every single user on their product if their experiences are by and large suitable for all audiences, the E rating, if you will. And so sometimes we'll have clients come in and say, hey, we want to do age verification. Can you help us understand the pros and cons? And my first question is like, okay, how many people do you want to verify? And when they say everyone, that's usually my first red flag. I'm like, why do you need to verify everyone? Like, what is your product? What exactly are you building? And so I think there are certainly approaches and strategies to age assurance that can say, hey, by and large, our product is suitable for everyone in the spaces where it is a restricted experience, or we want to provide an age-restricted experience. Okay, we're going to introduce age verification, but that doesn't mean that every single user is going to go through that. Like if you're a user who's just genuinely not interested in that piece of the product, then don't verify, you don't have to verify your age. So I do, like I said, I think again, there's just so much nuance there. And when these laws pass, the first response of companies is to be like, okay, what do I do? How do I stay compliant? What exactly needs to happen? And I think we kind of have to help slow them down a little and be like, okay, what exactly do you want to do with this information? And let's work backwards from that to see if you actually need to verify age, and if so, for which segment of users, and how vigorously, what exactly do you need to do?
Your mention of an E rating or like a G rating, if we're talking movies, that's interesting, and I haven't thought about it in that way, and maybe that's just my own lack of intellectual creativity, but it feels like an interesting idea, and I'm curious if how you would come about deciding what's E or what's the equivalent of G versus PG versus PG-13 versus R and NC-17 and whatever other ratings there might be.
Yeah, we've done projects like this where one, of course, very natural source of information is the existing classification ratings. And so we've done comparative analyses across, I think, 20 different film and movie board ratings to develop a taxonomy of what really is considered age appropriate by these boards in different countries for users of different ages. But that's not enough, because we all know that even those ratings are outdated in many ways. So I think you need to kind of supplement that with understanding how young people are engaging online, what their parents think is appropriate for them, what do academics and civil society recommend in terms of suitability of content. I've said this before on this podcast, but like a content moderation problem, if you will. We need community guidelines around what is an E rating. This is how we define it. So for product and policy wonks, this is just like the most fun project, I think.
So is there a way we can come up with this rating system prior to data transparency?
I think we can come up with a version of this system. I think data transparency will make everything better. And I don't say that lightly. I think insights into how people are actually using services, the actual scale and prevalence and volume of harm that they're experiencing online, that's invaluable data for us to be much more thoughtful. And I think sometimes we get stuck in this sort of vicious cycle of saying like, oh, we've come up with a policy, only to hear, well, this isn't how it actually works on a platform. Okay, tell us how it actually works on your platform. We can't do that. All right, we'll go and come up with a policy. That's not actually how it works on our platform. You get the picture. So that I think is really kind of challenging. I also kind of understand why it's been hard for companies to share data for so long. That's why I think things like DSA are so helpful, because it's a level playing field. No one company suddenly has to endure a huge competitive setback by sharing all of their information without any of their competitors or peers being required to do so. I think we need broader standards around data transparency.
You're speaking to my true love.
I think more broadly, we are in an age of, I think this is a little bit of a culture shift within tech, where we are in an age that demands a lot of tech platforms. And something that I think about a lot and have a lot of empathy for is that the largest platforms will be fine. They will staff and hire to address this. But I want to be really careful of not stifling growth and innovation at smaller and mid-sized companies in the process of doing this. That's also the only way we truly ensure competition in the market. So to the extent possible, sometimes I worry that the people who are forming regulations are forming all their regulations with exactly maybe 1 or 3 companies in mind, when there are literally thousands of companies building products and experiences for young people. So we do need a greater understanding of how young people are interacting in this space, the types of products that are serving them, and like a genuine understanding of those taxonomies of harm across different types of usage. That would be my one thing that I want everyone to know. And if anyone wants to work with us to make that happen, we would love to do that.
Okay, great. I'll be including a link to Vinum Strategies and Choir in the show notes here. And if anybody wants to get in touch with Vaishnavi, you can reach out to her on her website or message me, comment here, and I'll connect the dots. All right. Thank you so much, Vaishnavi. This is really informative, and I had a great time learning from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This was really fun.